Morning folks, I'm Andrew and today I'm out on a bike ride around Norwich and the local area. And I want to ask you a question. What have sheep, people's rights to roam common land and this place, which is Mousehold Heath, all got in common? And the answer is Kett's rebellion coming up. My route is going to begin here at Mousehold Heath, which is just to the north of Norwich, and I'm going to be routing south down to Wymondham Abbey, which is where this story all begins. I'm going to be seeking out some of the historical locations that are associated with Kett's rebellion. My route's going to take me up through the Tudor street of Elm Hill, and we'll have a look at some of the flint walls that are part of the medieval defence system of Norwich City. I'm going to be seeking out Kett's oak, the almost mythical oak tree that lies between Norwich and Wymondham, that's purported to be over 480 years old, perhaps one of the oldest living things in England. And then in a circular route, routing to the west of Norwich, I'm going to come back here to Mousehold, which is the final destination of Kett's rebellion.
Mousehold Heath is a freely accessible area of heathland and woodland which lies to the northeast of the medieval city boundary of Norwich. The name also refers to the much larger area of open heath that once extended from Norwich almost to the Broads and which was kept free of trees by both human activity and the action of animals grazing. Kett's rebellion was a revolt in Norfolk in Tudor England during the reign of Edward VI, the child king and only son of Henry VIII. It was largely in response to the enclosure of common land, but it also had religious complaints about the new Protestant Anglican Church. It began at Wymondham on the 8th of July 1549 with a group of rebels destroying fences that had been put up by wealthy landowners.
In true English understatement, Kett's rebellion was known as the Commotion Time, but in fact it was a very serious insurrection and it pitted the will of the peasant farmers against the full might of the Tudor King Royal Army. That would end up in a full-blown pitched battle here at Mousehold Heath and Dussingdale, and it would end in the death of thousands.
Norwich is located on the River Wensum, which was an important trade route with Europe. The medieval city was encircled by a large flint wall, with access through gates and over bridges. During the summer of 1549, Kett and his men laid siege to the city and took up positions on the high ground to the northeast. He positioned his headquarters at the disused chapel at Mount Surrey, now known as Kett's Heights. From here, Kett had a great view of the city landmarks and strategically the bridge at Bishop Gate. Kett probably knew that if he could secure a crossing at the bridge, he would gain access to the city through Palace Plain, past the tavern, known as the Adam and Eve pub. Kett and his council wrote a petition to the Lord Protector, Lord Somerset. It was written in a respectful, courteous manner that tried to appeal to Somerset's Protestant beliefs. They aimed to hold the enclosure of common land and to improve local government and clergy. Although Somerset sympathised with their requests, the King's Council did not. On the 21st of July, the King's Council offered the rebels a pardon if they dispersed, but this was declined. Kett initially attempted to cross Bishop's Bridge into Norwich, but the small garrison there held firm. In a second attack, the defenders were driven back, and the rebel forces crossed the River Wensum and took the city.
The story goes that one of the early skirmishes saw a cavalry unit engaging with Kett's men, and one of their leaders, a nobleman by the name of Edmund Sheffield, fell from his horse.
With no universal surrender mechanism for defeated soldiers, but knowing he was beaten, Sheffield decided to acknowledge his defeat by removing his helmet. This was an accepted practice amongst knights and military men, but meant nothing to the peasant farmers who had no idea of battle etiquette. A local butcher by the name of Mr. Fulker pressed home his advantage by bludgeoning Sheffield around his head, fatally wounding him. The King's men desperately carried Sheffield back to the tavern at the Adam and Eve pub in a vain attempt to save his life.
So this is the Adam and Eve pub where Edmund Sheffield was brought and unfortunately died, and they say that his ghost still haunts the pub to this day.
Riding up Bishop Gate and through the grounds of the cathedral, I follow the route of Kett's men as they advance on the city. There were many street fights. Eventually the King's men were defeated and Kett held the entire city for a month. He now had control over the wealthy merchants who traded from streets such as Elm Hill. Elm Hill is a well-preserved cobblestone Tudor street, which was rebuilt with tiled buildings and chimneys after a disastrous fire destroyed over 700 houses in Norwich around the year 1507. The Britain's Arms was the only building to survive, which is much older. Riding through the city of Norwich, I passed the castle where Kett would eventually be hanged, and onward to the southwest city wall.
All around Norwich they've got this medieval wall, flint wall, pretty robust looking thing. And there's still remnants of this, good stretches of it, including turrets and castellations like this one here. You can see by the thickness of this wall just how robust a defence system it was. I'm heading south out of Norwich towards Wymondham, and I'm on a road that is formerly now known as Kett's Oak, and just to the left of me is the main road, and there's really quite a nice cycle path to the right, or the west hand side, so hopefully I'll be arriving at the famous Kett's Oak itself in just a moment. If you were on a car, you probably wouldn't see it, you just flash by, but I've got an opportunity to pull over here on a bike. I'm going to have a look at it. So this is it, this is Kett's Oak, purportedly the location where Robert Kett sat and listened to the yeoman farmers from this region and their grievances. Now, this tree may or may not be the original tree, I'm not sure. I should imagine this whole area was probably populated by oaks and woods far more than it is today in the 21st century. We're talking about a period of about 480 years ago, so we're not quite sure of the authenticity of this actual tree. Now, this oak tree has got a number of plaques and notices on it. The first is the white one here that says Kett's Oak 1549. There's also a couple of other commemorative plaques that are worthy of note. The green one down here says, the Tree Council, in celebration of the Golden Jubilee of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, has designated the Kett's Oak as one of 50 Great British trees in recognition of its place in the national heritage, and that's dated June 2002. The silver plaque here basically gives an outline of Kett's rebellion. Now, a tree that purports to be 480 years old is probably going to be quite frail and fragile. And indeed, this tree here is being propped up by this large supporting member. It's also worthy to note to see these steel support rings that have completely grown into the bark. That definitely shows that this is an ancient oak tree. And inside the main trunk here, there's some concrete filled to stop the moisture going in and further rotting it. There's also a couple of other steel straps that I can see up here. Well, whatever the truth or the details or the authenticity of this great oak tree, it is in itself a fantastic tree, and it's certainly ancient. And the story goes that at least 9 of the rebels that were involved in the rebellion were brought here, tried and executed by hanging from this oak tree. And regardless of whether this is the tree or not, it symbolises a great moment in Tudor history.
Onward to the market town of Wymondham, where the rebellion first got started. King Henry VIII had established a Protestant Anglican church in 1534 and passed the Act of Supremacy, establishing himself the supreme head of the church. He thereafter began the disillusionment of the monasteries. The abbey at Wymondham was demoted to a parish church, but the locals were not necessarily happy with this. They continued to celebrate the Catholic martyrs such as Thomas Becket.
So I'm going through the town centre of Wymondham now, heading down towards the abbey.
On the weekend, 6th-7th of July 1549, the town held a festival at the abbey commemorating Becket. Wine flowed and tongues loosened. Menfolk shared their dislike of the quality of the new church clergy, and particularly their complaints about illegal enclosure of land.
Wow, look at that place there. Green Dragon. Proper Tudor looking building. This is the fabulous Wymondham Abbey, and this is the location of the start of the celebrations that led to the lighting the blue touch paper for the Kett's rebellion. And this is the location where Robert Kett's brother William was hung, and apparently he was thrown off one of these towers here. Pretty grim and gruesome ending. So behind me is Wymondham Abbey. This is the start and the end for Robert Kett's brother, William. I'm just going to take this moment now to have a sandwich and a cup of coffee. It's an absolutely glorious January day. As you can see, the sun is out, the sky is blue, and it's really quite mild. I'm really enjoying this trip out to Wymondham. It's an interesting name, Wymondham, spelt Wymondham or something like that, and another one of those strange sort of Norfolk pronunciations, Wymondham. After I've had my cup of coffee and a quick sandwich, I'll be rooting back to Norwich, where we'll pick up the rest of the story at Mousehold Heath and the Battle of Dussingdale. Robert Kett was a yeoman farmer, and he lived somewhere around here
in the countryside around Wymondham. And on that fateful morning, when he woke up in 1549, he looked out and he saw a rabble ripping down the fences that he'd put around some common land. Listening to their gripes, he actually decided to join them. Probably a man of moral integrity, or perhaps he had some other ulterior motives for power. But it wasn't long before he'd managed to gather quite a following. He listened to the peasant farmers and he realised that actually they had quite a just cause. Some of it was based on some religious intolerance. Most of it was based on the loss of their access to common land. So he volunteered to lead them. Before long, Robert Kett had amassed quite a following, some 16,000 peasant farmers and other labourers from various different backgrounds. And Robert Kett was quite an educated man. He was a landowner himself, and he had initially enclosed the common land for his own purposes. But by tearing down his own fences, he kind of sent the message to the peasants that he was definitely on their side, a man of his word, and he was trustworthy. So he led the 16,000 men, gathering them up from the local countryside as he moved from Wymondham here north towards Norwich to try and settle some of the schools.
The rebels now represented an army who moved north, crossing the rivers Wensum and Tudor towards Mousehold.
Well, I'm back here at Mousehold Heath, and this is where Kett eventually reached with his 16,000 men, and he set up camp here for at least a month while he lay siege to Norwich. This was no uncoordinated rabble. It's very well organised, and the accounts have it that Kett actually set up a sort of tribunal system or outdoor court where he would listen to the various grievances of the people, and he petitioned the king with a written ransom of the demands that he wanted. And interestingly, they believed that the law of the land was on their side because it had already been decreed that the enclosure of common land was illegal, and so Kett and his men felt that they were very much on the right side of the law. Hard to imagine nowadays this peaceful and tranquil spot was once the gathering of Kett and his men. And one of the things that really appeals to me about the whole Kett rebellion story is the way that Kett, he didn't refer to any kind of greater supernatural power to host his courts. He just came out into nature and sat underneath a great oak tree, perhaps like this one. And I love the idea that the tree was the symbol of his authority. Now, nobody knows the exact location where the Battle of Dussingdale was fought, but it was probably to an area just to the northeast of here, when Mousehold used to stretch out towards the villages of Plumstead, and it was in the area known as the Dussingdale Valley. So the two opposing forces consisted of roughly the same amount of people. There was about 16,000 rebel farmers. Kett had managed to acquire a number of cannon. He also had some muskets, longbowmen, pikemen, but generally speaking, they were ill-disciplined and not trained in warfare. While on the royal side, there was cannon, cavalry, foot soldiers, pikemen, and, importantly, about 1,200 German mercenaries. So this was the third of the battles of the revolt, and it was the final and conclusive one that saw victory for the royalist army and the defeat of the rebels. So the battle was fought, it was bloody and intense, and the reports are of at least 3,000 rebel peasant farmers being killed to about 250 royalists, and really it was a rout. William and Robert Kett fled the scene and were eventually caught a few days later at the village of Swannington to the west of here. As previously stated, William Kett was hung from the Abbey at Wymondham. Robert Kett was tried at the Tower of London and found guilty of treason. He was brought back to Norwich, where he was hanged on the wall of the castle. It's said that his body was hung for up to 3 years as a reminder to the public of the consequences of such a serious rebellion. So that concludes my bike ride around the historic sites that were part of the Kett's rebellion. It started here at Mousehold and it's finished here at Mousehold. And I've done approximately 45 to 50 kilometres in a round trip. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks very much for following me, and until the next time, happy riding. Well, what of Robert Kett's legacy? Well, at least he got a street named after him, Kett's Hill.